I am quite fond of armor, especially plate armor. When drawing things such as armor, it can be quite difficult to make them look realistic. Trying to actually portray metal is tricky. So today we will learn how to draw metal, or to be more precise, we will go over how to render metallic surfaces. The most important thing to understand when we want to draw a metallic surface is how light interacts with our surface. To understand how metal interacts with light, we're going to use this sphere. Okay, it's not really a sphere yet, more like a colored circle. So let's add some light and shadow. When shading, keep the core shadow in mind. The core shadow is the darkest part of any object. It is that way because it's neither hit by direct or reflected light. Also try to add a little reflected light where our object is touching the surface. Okay, so now that that's done, let's just quickly summarize what we need to apply when shading an object, in this case our sphere. We need to apply a light, a highlight, a shadow core, a reflected light, and a cast shadow. Okay, now that this is done, how do we make our sphere look like it's made of metal? With metallics, the only real difference is a stronger core shadow and a stronger highlight, as well as more reflected light. Metallics tend to reflect more light than other surfaces. Another important thing to note is that light follows the direction of the metal. We notice this mainly in the highlight. Another important property of metal is that, like a mirror, metal reflects not just light, but also its surroundings. Just like with light, the reflections will follow the shape of the metal. Drawing simple reflections in our metal will help them look that little bit more convincing. When drawing reflections, they don't need to be very detailed or overtly complicated. Little side note, this does not apply to metallics in an empty space, as there is nothing for them to reflect. Alongside that, it's also just a good thing to know, even if we won't apply this knowledge to its fullest every time we draw. Up until now, we've been talking about perfect metal, neatly polished without even so much as a hint of imperfections. But metal will always have imperfections. Maybe because of the forging process or through many battles. That's just the nature of things. Metal will have some signs of usage. There are very few circumstances where that is not the case. Now, the obvious question is, how do we show the wear and tear of our metal? Well, for starters, we will lessen the reflections. Rough metals will reflect their surroundings, but very subdued. For example, we will simply blur our reflection heavily and turn down the opacity of the layer. Note, this obviously will not work on paper, but the same mindset still applies. Next, we're gonna lessen the highlight. Same as with the reflections, our used metal will reflect light in a much more subdued way. Once we did all that, our metals just look matte. So, to truly make it look used, we need to add things like scratches, for example. Adding scratches is very easy. We simply add some lines with our light color all around the surface of our object. Same rules as with everything else. The scratches will follow the shape of our object. Scratching our metal is just the surface. We can add loads of other details to give our metal some character. For example, we can add rust, or take a texture brush and add little surface imperfections, or maybe some huge holes, craters to imply heavy impacts to our metal. How we choose to do this is completely up for us to decide. We can really add some individuality to our metallic objects. Another thing that is beneficial for us to know is how different metals interact with light. For example, gold. Gold is one of the most used metals in art. We see a lot of gold armor, trim, weapons, etc. When drawing gold, we can differentiate by keeping in mind that when gold interacts with light, it reflects it with a yellow tint. Same goes for reflections. Everything we see that is reflected by gold will appear more yellow. Of course, this wasn't a very in-depth look at gold, but I do think it counts as a sufficient example of how different some metals react to their surroundings. Now we mostly understand what makes metal look like metal. But all this explaining leaves us with one big question. How do we study metal? To actually learn how to draw metal, we need at the very least a basic understanding of light and how light interacts with our world. Specifically, we need to understand how a singular object is influenced by a singular light source. Most of how metal works is just understanding the fundamentals of light. When drawing metals, don't just use gray as a base color. Try using a gray that has a bit of a bluish hue. Of course, this doesn't apply to metals like gold or copper. Also, remember that when painting on the reflections, they're gonna have colors. Basic metals like steel don't tint their reflections. If we just draw them in grayscale, it will rob our metals of life and realism. Good, now that that's covered, onto the photo study. I suggest that when we study metal, we don't use some crazy texture brush. Our goal is to understand how and why metal does what it does, and overcomplicating that process is only gonna lead to confusion and unsatisfying results. I like to stick to one simple brush. The best answer, of course, is the almighty round brush. But it can be any brush that you personally prefer. We just have to make sure that we don't overcomplicate the process. Simple brushes are the best for that. Also, don't start with drawing the details. Start with the big surfaces and then add details after. This might seem obvious to most of you, but I made this mistake a lot when starting out, so I just wanted to mention it here, just to be sure. That should about cover the basics. But there is so much more to learn, so many things that I don't even know yet. And personally, I can't wait to learn all of it. But anyways, metal is something that I am, to my own surprise, quite passionate about. I just have fun drawing it. That's why I hope that I could share some of that fun with you today. I hope to someday come back to this video and see how I have improved. And hopefully you can do the same. So as always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you soon in the next one. Bye bye.